Twitter is relentlessly horrid. In just a matter of years, Twitter, a site infested with bored-up repression, Chinese agents, and toxic sludge, mimics and provokes the moral decay of our society. The lonely, empty hatred that hangs across the internet all permeates from Twitter. There's absolutely no doubt that Twitter is a monument to our cultural and societal collapse, because Twitter's imposing a trend of repulsive censorship, which is desecrating the pillars of democracy. Twitter is the fever dream of authoritarians across the world, but this wasn't always the case. Twitter never used to call the British flag problematic. Twitter never used to persuade people to commit crimes, sleep around, never form long-term relationships, and to hate your family and neighbours. Twitter was instead a force of change. It was the beacon of a new wave of freedom, headed by the freedom-loving hippie Jack Dorsey. Back then, Twitter was taking down evil regimes across the world. It was the bane of authoritarians. Twitter served as the catalyst for a wave of freedom across the planet. But then something horrible happened.
By using Twitter as what he called a weapon to counter negative narratives about China.
How did Twitter, an intended tool for democracy, become its mirror, its inversion, a tool for censorship?
Twitter was hijacked. So what was it that caused Twitter to become so toxic? How did Twitter go from being a catalyst to freedom to a catalyst for misery? How did Twitter become the engine of our societal collapse? Was it destined from the start? Was it inevitable? Or was Twitter compromised by something else, somebody else? Well, stick with me here as we unravel the tragic tale of Twitter. Back in 2005, the founders of Twitter had no idea they would create the most important battleground in international politics, because in this time, the internet was in its infancy. Facebook and YouTube had just been released, and the average citizen still had an attention span. In 2005, the founders of Twitter were working on a podcast platform called Odeo. Noah Glass, one of Odeo's co-founders, worked with his friend Evan Williams to launch the platform for podcast creation and distribution. And after getting some initial traction, Evan Williams was made CEO to attract new investors. The ploy worked, and Evan's appointment brought even more money into the company. However, after Apple's announcement of its own competing podcast platform built directly into iTunes, Odeo's fortune was short-lived. But instead of cutting their losses, Noah and Evan dug in their teeth to restructure the company, with the main question being, how could they compete with the monolith that is Apple? They brainstormed ideas until one of Odeo's new employees, Jack Dorsey, suggested a new idea. The idea being Twitter, a platform to discuss ideas away from podcasts and radio in favor of digestible chunks of text. Noah quickly took to the idea, and so soon enough, Odeo started to funnel all its resources into Twitter. The three men saw its huge potential, and everything seemed to be going great. But underneath the surface, Machiavellian moves were being made. It was at this point that Noah confessed to Jack Dorsey that he thought they should kick Evan out of the company. But Jack was already 2 steps ahead. After convincing Evan, Jack played his cards, and the decision was made to fire Noah. "I did feel betrayed," Noah said. "I felt betrayed by my friends, by my company, by these people around me I trusted and that I had worked so hard to create something with." And this was only the beginning of the betrayals and duplicity that would later come to define Twitter. This was the start of a multi-billion 4D chess game. After removing Noah and consolidating their power, Jack and Evan began to make their next moves. By this time, Odeo was well on its way out, because Twitter had become the main product. But for reasons that came clear later, Evan had started to pull back from his position as it became supposedly too much to handle. So Evan resigned as CEO, leaving Jack Dorsey to fill the vacuum. During this time, Twitter was growing exponentially. Celebrities, influencers, politicians, and journalists were all scrambling to the site. In fact, so many new users and tweets were being made that Twitter servers couldn't handle it. Crashes were common, and so investors and Evan would begin to turn on Jack Dorsey, as Jack and the company seemed to be spiraling out of control. Complaints from employees about Jack's unprofessional attitude and lack of management skills were beginning to pile up. And it became clear that Evan never wanted to be removed from power. He really didn't want his underling Jack Dorsey to run the company. Instead, this was a power game. Evan began to convince the shareholders to overthrow Dorsey, although this was a hard sell considering Twitter's growth and upward trajectory. But with just enough manipulation, the CEO role changed hands again, and Jack was banished. Evan had won the chess game. He'd removed all his competitors' power and reasserted his throne as CEO once again. It seemed as though Evan was primed to win the power struggle for Twitter, but Jack wouldn't go down without a fight. Jack used his position and Twitter's newfound fame to begin promoting the product to the world, with himself as the spokesman.
I would not go away from that. I'm still a punk.
While Jack was doing interviews with Oprah and appearing at numerous tech conferences, Evan was settling into his position as CEO. However, Evan's time didn't last very long, and in just under 2 years, he began to step down, as he was replaced by the company's former COO, Dick Costello.
A few years ago, I got fired from being the CEO of Twitter, which was incredibly hard and devastating.
These erratic and confusing power struggles would continue as Twitter solidified its position at the top, with everyone involved plotting and scheming to get their piece of the pie. We can see from this pattern so far that a likely culprit for Evan's fall from grace would obviously be Jack, because Jack wanted his revenge from the start, and after pulling the strings for years, Jack made his final move in 2015, returning once again as CEO. But this Twitter 4D chess game has only just begun. The intrigue still hasn't stopped to this day for Twitter, with Jack leaving his position as CEO in November 2021, and already these power-hungry practices have had awful effects for the victims. For example, although Noah was essential in founding Twitter, and even giving Twitter its name, he gained almost nothing for his work. These days he's almost entirely forgotten, with very few even knowing the story of how he was cheated out of billions. With this persistent backstabbing and culture of cutthroat business tactics, it's no wonder that Twitter's board of directors is now aiming their talent for malice and manipulation straight at its user base. It's clear to all to see that the control over discussion and free speech that Twitter now holds is being exploited by the people in power, just as they exploited each other to gain that power. They do this in numerous insidious ways, the foremost being their silencing of certain politicians and political discourse itself. The most infamous of these offenses was the banning of Trump from the platform. It was this move by power-hungry Twitter executives that would come to define Twitter's future. Before the waves of banning and censorship, Twitter was the virtual town square, where everyone would give their opinions and stick their fingers up at authoritarianism. In fact, this philosophy was a part of Jack Dorsey's main message. In 2009, Jack Dorsey claimed, quote, "Twitter is the free speech wing of the free speech party," because Twitter was a place to give everyone the power to create and share ideas instantly without barriers. It was this sentiment that fostered global Twitter revolutions, most famously the Arab Spring riots across countries like Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, and even back in the United States, Twitter served as the catalyst for the Occupy Wall Street movements. But like all sweet things, comes the inevitable consequences. With Twitter's increasing annual revenue, advertisers, corporations, and governments understood one thing. With Twitter's power and influence, the elites would soon be held too accountable for their liking, so things began to slowly change. The free speech core that defined Twitter began to rot, and today, we are living in the aftermath. As Twitter's popularity continued to grow, bigger demands came down from above. Following the Arab Spring riots and the Occupy Wall Street movements, the cracks within society were beginning to surface. This was very dangerous for the elite, because if you're going to run a country for the benefit of a few, it's very dangerous to let people complain about it. Free speech is the enemy of authoritarians. That's why the countries most affected by Twitter's free-thinking attitude would be swift to ban Twitter completely. China, Egypt, Iraq, Nigeria, Turkey, Venezuela, Iran, and Turkmenistan. But for Western countries built on the foundations of free speech and freedom of thought, this sort of government action would look very ugly, as free speech is an enshrined right of every one of us, and it's why the elite seek to kill it. And to kill it, they would need to control Twitter entirely, as the only way to impose unpopular policies on the population is through fear and silence. Well, this begs the question, what does it look like when the flow of information has been hijacked by more sinister interests? Well, that's where things become much more interesting. Since 2015, following Trump's unprecedented ascension into the White House, censorship has risen considerably on Twitter. For the last 7 years, Twitter barely hides its contempt for free speech, banning people for hateful conduct to anyone who questions the narrative, engaging in numerous purges to clean out dissent, even if a user hasn't broken any rules, only to further stoke the flames of counterculture and spit on the face of free thought. And there are just endless examples of censorship that would just drag out this video for way too long, but one of the most grotesque examples of this came up during the 2020 presidential campaign. During the presidential campaign, it became very apparent that Biden's family was compromised by corruption and dodgy foreign deals, most famously with the Ukrainian gas company.
Now Joe Biden's only surviving son has found himself at the center of a controversy over his business dealings with the Chinese Communist Party and the Ukraine government.
In any normal society, this would raise a lot of questions about a man soon to become the president. In any normal society, a story like this would spread like wildfire. Everyone on social media would be talking about it. It would desecrate any political candidate's hopes of becoming president. But in this campaign, that wasn't the case. Far from it. The story barely made a dent in Biden's presidential bid. So why was this the case? Well, because of big tech censorship. Twitter knowingly suppressed the story from properly developing in the eyes of the public and outright banned certain viewpoints on the affair. In the build-up to the 2020 US presidential election, the New York Post published an article detailing information about Hunter Biden's involvement. It was titled "Smoking Gun Email Reveals How Hunter Biden Introduced Ukrainian Businessman to VP Dad." Despite the fact that this article was from a totally legitimate news source, Twitter suppressed it anyway. They even removed posts linking to the article, and in doing so, they went far beyond just simply suppressing an individual's right of free speech. This event marked the first time that Twitter has repressed the freedom of the press on their own platform. And then the CEO Jack Dorsey later made a half-hearted apology, stating in a tweet, "Our communication around our actions on the New York Post article was not great. In a free society, dissent is tolerated. Reason and civil discussion is encouraged. People aren't punished for wrongthink, no matter how stupid. Sure, people are influenced into what views they may have, but this isn't controlled. Your thoughts are your choice." But now this sort of reasoning is perceived as a threat. So it shouldn't be any surprise that as soon as Biden was swept into office, the Twitter vultures swept in and banished Trump from the site. Because Trump's influence on Twitter was eroding the influence of the mainstream media, always putting him ahead of the news cycle. Now there are two ways that you could see Trump's ban. Either this was done as a purely cynical, business-focused decision as Twitter was pilloried as the co-conspirator of Trump's rise, or it was a directed attack with collusion of mainstream media, lawmakers and advertisers against the free speech of one whole side of the political spectrum. Both of these options speaks volumes of Twitter, because it shows that Twitter isn't above manipulating and banning you for money, even if this comes at the price of a healthy society. This is cultural imperialism, where a handful of technocratic elites silence political outrage over actions that destroy the masses' lives. Big tech giants like Jack Dorsey like to pretend they're for free speech and progressivism, because to publicly stand for censorship in the status quo would look very ugly, and this is the problem with our stilted, room temperature political discourse. No one stands up to this. It's so bad that even congressmen and senators beg Jack Dorsey for more censorship to prevent any, quote, misinformation. That's why Twitter's control of perception is accepted and even encouraged. It's why the prevailing drivel of Twitter journalism assumes every adult is a complete boneheaded droog. This isn't democracy, this is their democracy. This isn't questioned on a widespread level because the journalists whose duty it is to hold the powerful accountable are now the servants to power. In fact, they're in the same group. They dine with the big tech executives, they play the game and are rewarded by Twitter's algorithms and censorship teams for their conformity. And now, thanks to the surge in bots, governments and companies around the world are freely molding the minds of a generation. Because of Twitter's wide open application programming interface, Chinese and Russian bots have infested the site. In just 2018 alone, Twitter released over 9 million tweets connected to the Russian Internet Research Agency. Many of these bots were attempting to influence Twitter users' thoughts on the Ukrainian issue. And when it comes to China, Twitter actively works to censor on behalf of authoritarians. Like when Professor Anne-Marie Brady was suspended just for mocking China's 100-year communist celebration. But after the banning of Trump in 2021, Twitter would begin to nosedive into censorship we've never seen before. But before we move on to this next section, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Masterworks.io. Over the last year, the banks have been printing more and more money, causing inflation to rise by 6.8% in 2021. To counter this, a lot of people invest in gold, stocks, or cryptocurrencies. However, a newer, more interesting way to counter this inflation is to invest in art. But you may ask, why art? Well, since art has a low correlation, if the market starts correcting, the value of art wouldn't fall in value as much as the broader stock market. In fact, art is an asset class that outpaced the S&P 500 by 174% from 1995 to 2020. This is almost triple the appreciation of real estate, gold, and 90% of cryptocurrencies in the same time frame. In fact, the art market has grown 2,700% in the last 20 years with no signs of slowing down. And thanks to Masterworks.io, you don't need to be a millionaire or billionaire to tap into the market. Masterworks.io is the first and only online platform that allows everyone to buy and sell shares in multi-million-dollar artworks. Their platform features artists such as Picasso, Banksy, Andy Warhol, and many more. And with Masterworks, you don't need millions to add fine art to your portfolio. You can sign up and invest in Masterworks in just a few clicks. First, you go to their website and create an account. After that, you can browse their artwork and select how much you want to invest. And then from there, you can either hold your shares until Masterworks sells the painting, or trade your shares on the secondary market. However, with 270,000 people signed up, demand is high. So I'm working with Masterworks.io so that you can skip their waitlist and get priority access. Just click the link in the description below. Now back to the video. Soon after Trump's banishment to the digital gulag, Twitter took off its mask of free speech once and for all, and just 1 month after Trump's silencing, a tirade of censorship would begin. One of the biggest of these cases was when Twitter went on to ban all government opposition to President Modi, all in an effort to quell the Indian farmer protests. Now, what did these Indian farmers do exactly? Were they right-wingers? No, they were farmers who had their land and labour stolen from them. These farmers demanded protection from mega corporations like Monsanto, killing off their businesses and family. They didn't want to starve, they were desperate for nutrition, and support across India for these farmers was huge, and soon these protests became a nationwide general strike in support of farmers and workers. So what did Twitter do? They censored these protesters into silence, permanently blocking more than 500 accounts supporting the protests. Back in the US, the ongoing spread of the virus took away the careers and businesses of many of those asking questions throughout this period. Anyone and everyone would be censored for asking questions about certain labs, and if the closure of businesses was really a good thing to do. Twitter's chilling of genuine discussion got worse and worse until eventually Robert Malone, the man behind Pfizer's shot, was sent to the digital gulag. So why was Robert Malone banished? Because a man with more information than about almost all of us, and certainly anyone at Twitter, was asking too many questions. But the most egregious of all has to be the banning of the Maxwell Trial Tracker. The Trial Tracker was a Twitter page documenting Maxwell's court case, a court case that had been shunned from the limelight, a court case involving the most prolific musicians, writers, politicians and billionaires that couldn't be broadcast to the general populace, because that would be far too risky, and it's probably why you never saw any of this court case in the news, even though it's the most important trial of the decade. So the Maxwell Trial Tracker took on the duty to show the public the unfiltered raw facts of the court case. But something like this, something going against the narrative, something highlighting the grisly nature of those ruling our countries, was too inconvenient. So Twitter acted, as you'd expect, by permanently banning the Maxwell Trial Tracker page. And I could just go on and on about the countless examples of censorship on Twitter, but there's just far too many to talk about. I mean, on a wider political scale, of the 22 high-profile bannings on the site, 21 of them were on one side of the political spectrum. Can you guess which side it was? Twitter attempts to justify this bias by using wiggle words like public interest. But the question is free speech not in the public interest? How could the public interest even be known without free speech? The public interest is in free and open discussion, not in what Twitter executives think. The flimsy justification for Twitter's censorship is to prevent supposedly real-world harm, but as we've seen, their repressive acts lead directly to much worse consequences for both people and society itself. And they know this, of course, but acknowledging it and doing the right thing would prevent them from pushing their biased agenda, or the agendas of others. So you'd think that with Jack Dorsey finally resigning as CEO of the company, that this censorship might fade away, but the sad truth is that all of these problems are only going to get worse. Recently, Twitter appointed a new CEO, Parag Agrawal. To get an idea of who Parag is, let's take a look at his thoughts on free speech. A few months ago, he did an interview with Technology Review before he became CEO, claiming that, quote, "Twitter's role is not to be bound by the First Amendment, but our role is to serve a healthy public conversation, and to focus less on thinking about free speech, but instead thinking about how the times have changed." I mean, this quote speaks for itself, as we've already established freedom of speech ranks extremely low on Twitter's radar. They're so encouraged to do this at this point that they openly admit it. And in that same interview, Parag also said that Twitter's emphasis is now on who can be heard. This both means that Twitter itself wants to control what you're allowed to hear, and also silence those they don't want you to hear. But again, this is all for a supposed healthy conversation. The reluctance to denounce this, and influencers, commentators, journalists, and lawmakers' encouragement of censorship is a result of a deep reticence. A reticence to critique censorship for fears of being labelled a right-winger. But this should never be a bipartisan issue. This fascistic censorship model adopted by Twitter would be bad enough if this was confined to their employees alone, but this fascistic mentality now permeates modern culture and society. It is eroding the fabric of Western civilization. The only thing we can do, the only power we have left, is to put a spotlight on such evil and call out big tech censorship for what it truly is: authoritarianism.